Well, today is the first round of the 2024 NBA draft, and while Anton Watson likely won't get picked until Thursday, if at all, we're going to discuss why he is a sleeper in this draft class.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Wednesday. Happy draft day. Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Gametime. Folks, download the Gametime app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Well, I am thrilled to be joined today by Rowan Kent, a writer at No Ceilings, covering the NBA draft. They do fantastic work over at No Ceilings. If you don't follow them right now, you should. Check out their work. Check out Rowan's work. It's fantastic stuff. We're going to discuss all things NBA draft today. We're, of course, going to lead talking about Anton Watson, his profile, his strengths, weaknesses, etc. We're also going to talk about current Gonzaga players who might be in future NBA drafts. We'll talk Michael Ajayi. Might talk about a handful of other guys on the roster who could be future NBA players. We're going to close out the show talking about Jonathan Mogbo from San Francisco, as well as a pair of Wazoo alums, Isaac Jones and Jaylen Wells. Rowan, let's start, though, with what could be the next player selected in the NBA draft out of Gonzaga University, Anton Watson. He hasn't been showing up on a lot of mock drafts. He showed up on a few. He showed up on the ones that I have written, at least, but we haven't seen him on a ton of mocks. He kind of feels like a borderline second-round pick, priority undrafted free agent type. You wrote a fantastic article a while back describing Anton Watson as a skeleton key. I loved that comparison. I love kind of your analysis on that. So I want to just give you an opportunity to kind of explain just give a quick and dirty Anton Watson draft profile here on the podcast, and we can kind of talk about his strengths and weaknesses from there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on, Andy. Getting to talk about a player like Watson is why I do this. Mm-hmm. He's a really fun, to start at maybe the most basic level, a really fun basketball player because of the energy and the motor that he has. He's someone who just does not stop competing at times, even after the whistle. And what I really noticed as I watched him that made me dub him as a skeleton key was the ways that he can just fit into whatever problem the Zags were having on the floor and be able to solve it. This both on offensive end and on the defensive end, a mark that obviously in the NBA, being able to be versatile on both ends is at a premium in the way the game works today. But Watson can just fill so many holes and can make so many flawed lineups, not only at the college level, but at the NBA level, work even better. I think as a defensive player, it's where I started when writing, because there are a few players where you get really excited and jazzed about their defense. And with Watson, you get that right away. He has the size, he has the wingspan, the foot speed, the fluidity. He's someone who moves around really freely when defenses that he's in are rotating. You can trust him to be in the right spot. He can match up with smaller or larger players on the ball. You can trust him in off-ball actions to fight through screens. And he does create these game sort of shifting plays. He isn't a total like steals magnet or like rim protector in that way. But the steal and block percentages that he's had his whole career speak to someone who does make some sort of turnover generating plays. Those are stats that do have a good translation rate to the next level. On the offensive end, he's really fun to watch as basically outside of some parts of his shooting. He's a pretty complete package. He runs the floor well, like most guys who are as athletic as him. He's hard to stop in transition, finishes really well at the rim, cuts really smartly. He's someone who you can trust with the ball in his hands off of secondary actions. He's going to keep all of the good times rolling. He's going to keep an offense flowing. His shot is something that's starting to come along in a way that, at least in my perspective, makes it intriguing. You can't totally say that he can be a full stretch, like combo forward. But given how he's improved in his time with the Zags, it's not unheard of and not super out of the question to see him get to improve on that shooting as well. You might have loved to see some better free throw shooting. You might have loved to see increased volume. It also wasn't his role. His role on the team was to patch the holes, was to be getting to the rim, keeping everything moving. So I'm not going to knock him for what he wasn't asked to do. I'll more highlight that's something he could do in the future.
One of the things that really struck me about Watson this past season and Gonzaga in general is there was a lot of talk about the team's mid-season starting lineup change. They bring Ben Gregg in to start. They start bringing Dusty Stromer off the bench, and obviously the conversations around that move were primarily focused on those two players. Like, this is Ben being able to start as a testament to his versatility as a three-point shooter, etc. For Dusty, it made sense to bring him back off the bench where we think he was more kind of expecting to be before the Steele Venters injury. But what struck me about that is you can't make a move where you bench a 6'6" skinny freshman wing and bring in a 6'10" bulky power forward into the starting lineup unless you have a player like Watson who has the versatility to play the three, to play the four. You can move him around. I mean, I struggled to define Watson's position last year because I was like, well, he's kind of the four, but he's also kind of the three, and he played defense on the perimeter, but he was a low post scorer, but he also spaced the floor more than usual. And like, Mark Few has started to embrace positionless basketball to an extent. He's still got a pretty distinct point guard, a pretty distinct center, but Watson really was this versatile, do everything type of guy, like you said. And in games where nobody else had it, I mean, the UCLA game was a complete mess of a basketball game. Two teams both had played two games back to back. It was just a disaster of foul calls. And Anton Watson goes out and drops 35. And Gonzaga's lost to Santa Clara, one of their worst games of the season. I think he had 34 or 35. And it's like you said, when there's an issue, when there's a hole, when there's a problem, that was the guy that was asked to solve it. And for a team that was as good as Gonzaga was last year and had their ups and downs, he was Mr. Reliable and really did a little bit of everything. And I think, it's hard for me to not see how that translates at the next level. I worry about the shooting. I don't know how you can not worry about the shooting. And people will look at the box score, they'll look at Basketball Reference and be like, well, he shot 41% last year. Yeah, it was a tiny volume. And yes, he improved his three-point percentage every year he was in college. It started at 11%. So it really didn't have anywhere to go but up. And he did increase his volume every year as well, but it was still like 1.5 3-point attempts per game was the highest volume that he ever had. You're right that he wasn't asked to do that, but I think it's reasonable for NBA scouts when looking at this package and looking at this player to wonder, like, hey, if he's not somebody who can space the floor, what does his role look like? And I think, to me, that seems like the big question mark that teams are having right now, and the reason that we're not seeing him consistently on those mock drafts.
Yeah, with how much shooting has become an essential skill for players, that really speaks to, regardless of what he's done well, likely to say that's the question he's had to answer in interviews and in private workouts. Teams have probably put him through a lot of shooting drills, wanting to see the form, see if those incremental increases in percentage can match up with what they are seeing, not just by the box score. I think that the second round of the draft will be one. Almost all of the teams there have traded those picks before the draft. There's a lot of movement that will likely go on for the draft capital. And so finding his range is pretty difficult because finding anyone's range at this draft is pretty difficult. But I think that whether it's in the second round or as a priority undrafted free agent, there will be a team or a number of teams that are vying for his talents to bring him in to see if he can keep improving.
Well, I want to move on, Rowan, and talk about some players who are currently on Gonzaga who are going to be on the draft radar in the future. We'll start with Michael Ajayi, of course, because he is somebody who we already know is going to be on the draft radar as he was through the draft process this year. We're going to get to Ajayi. We're going to talk about a handful of other players on Gonzaga's roster as well. All of that coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, Gametime. Folks, minor league baseball season is officially underway, and as somebody who lives about 10 minutes away from the Hillsborough Hop Stadium, I love being able to make a last-minute decision to head out to the ballpark. And that's why I use Gametime, because prices on the Gametime app, they actually go down. the closer it gets to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. And if you're somebody who's concerned about buying fake tickets from a third-party source, you're worried you're going to get turned away at the gate, it's going to be embarrassing, all that good stuff. The great thing about Gametime is they have the most flexible customer service policy in the entire ticketing industry. And I personally love having that peace of mind. So folks, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. There's two $15 tickets to a minor league baseball game. You can get them both for $10 if you create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, Rowan, moving on now. We talked about Anton Watson. Very excited to see where he ends up. I think you're right. He's going to be late second, maybe undrafted. Kind of depends at that point if he wants to pick his own team. I know that was the Drew Timme situation where he was like, I'm going to pick a team. I don't want to get drafted at the end. We'll see what happens with Watson. But I do want to move on and talk about players who are currently on Gonzaga's roster. And we'll start with Michael Ajayi because he waited until the last day. And we talked about it on the show a handful of times. I don't blame him for doing that. He was working out with Toronto the day of the NBA draft deadline. And I don't know whether he had made up his mind in his head on what he was going to do, but why not get as much feedback as you possibly can right up until the very last minute. Ajayi is, of course, a player who we have yet to see in a Gonzaga uniform. He's transferring in from Pepperdine, averaged 17 and 10 last year for the Waves, was a junior college player prior to that. Big guy, versatile, can kind of play like 3-4 hybrid. I'm curious how Mark Few is going to deploy him and what role he's going to fill for this team. Somewhat similar to Watson, was a good three-point shooter, but on a low volume. I think we'll probably see an increase in that volume, again, depending on the role he's given. But from what you've seen from him, combine data, all that stuff, kind of what do you think about Ajayi's potential NBA future, knowing that, we don't exactly know what that role is going to look like at Gonzaga yet?
Yeah, and looking at where Ajayi could fall, I think he is a 2025 draft prospect. I think that he'll end up potentially not just on mine, but on other like preseason boards. In looking across Gonzaga's roster, he's one of the clear players as the highest pro potential. That shooting that you talked about, if he comes in and is continuing to improve, last season he took 2.5 threes a game, canning those at 47%. A number like that would really help not only Gonzaga, but would put him on draft radars. Yeah. It's likely that with the difference in his role on a different team, that could go down. At the same time, his floor spacing will be key for a guy that size. The way that he can move to get into those shots is really important. I think going from being the top dog on a Pepperdine team that we don't really need to say much more than that, going through a program with a pedigree of winning, playing for Mark Few, where he won't have that leash, he won't have that same freedom in the way that he did there. It's honestly maybe more instructive to teams to see how he can adapt his role, get to play more in a system that will be in some ways more similar to what he does at the next level. And that's where, even if he might have reduced stats, putting up 17 and 10 next year would put him in easy first round conversation. He can have maybe worse counting stats, similar efficiency, production, similar advanced statistics, and have a similar impact, but instead have winning basketball be something he can put on his resume. And that would be what helps him to cement his name in the draft. For myself, he'll definitely be in my initial top 100, probably pushing for my top 60 big board. It'll be something that you'll see from other people who are really plugged into having watched Ajayi before. Not as many had. He played for Pepperdine, and I think that he'll open eyes in a really exciting way.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the role, the potentially not likely smaller role being a positive for him in draft circles, because I believe that too. And I think maybe people who aren't as draft focused don't necessarily think about that. And they're like, oh, well, Ajayi is going to average something like 12 and 6 or 12 and 7 instead of 17 and 10. That's going to hurt his draft stock. That's not necessarily true. And I think you're absolutely right. Like Gonzaga's more of a pro style offense than a lot of other universities. They're not fully pro style. Obviously, they rely heavily on pounding the ball in the paint, which is not really happening in the modern NBA. But the run and gun, they get out in transition. They do a lot of ball screen actions. Like, I think there are some similarities, and we've seen players thrive in smaller roles coming to Gonzaga from smaller schools in the past. He's not the first player to do this. And I do think as an NBA, I would think as an NBA scout, I'd rather see him playing a smaller role, because Michael Ajayi is not going to get drafted to a team that's going to feature him in the NBA. That's not going to happen. So you'd rather, like, again, that's why I think Watson is somebody who's versatile or valuable as an NBA prospect, because he doesn't need the ball in his hands to be successful. And I think teams are going to want to see that with Ajayi. And because of what his role looked like at Pepperdine, they haven't really gotten a chance to see that. And so I see him filling a role where, he's not going to get as many touches. He's not going to get as many rebounds. He's not going to put up quite as many points. But like you said, if the efficiency doesn't drop or even improves, he feels like a pretty slam dunk, at least second round guy next year, just with the size, the physicality, if he tests well next year. Yeah, I think he's if Anton Watson's not the next player selected out of Gonzaga in the NBA draft, I think Michael Ajayi is. I think that feels like a fair statement to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And while the next year's draft has a lot of maybe clear star talent, it might be a bit more top heavy than this one, which is a bit flatter as you look down, and that would provide a great opportunity for Ajayi.
Wanted to talk about some of the other players on Gonzaga's roster, and I've talked about this a few times as this month has kind of been draft focused on the show. And Gonzaga's got a lot of really talented players. They have two guys in particular that I truly think are going to compete to be All-Americans this year in Graham Ike and Ryan Nembhard, who are also two players, incidentally, that I'm not sure I see a strong NBA future for. Ike just doesn't fill a role that is utilized in the NBA. I mean, if Drew Timme didn't make it, Graham Ike is not going to make it. And that's no disrespect to either of them. It's just the way the current NBA is. And I think Ryan Nembhard, obviously his brother Andrew had a ton of success, particularly in the playoffs this last year. But there's 5 inches in height between Andrew Nembhard and Ryan Nembhard, and that feels like enough to potentially curtail the younger Nembhard's draft profile. Unfortunately, similar situation with Nolan Hickman. He's a 6'2" two guard. It's really hard to make it in the NBA as an undersized two, but there are a couple guys on this roster that I do think have some NBA potential. Dusty Stromer, we haven't seen enough of him to really know, but there's some intrigue there with his length, with his size and his defensive instincts. Ben Gregg is kind of your prototypical stretch four. He reminds me a lot of Killian Tilly, who did get some looks in the NBA and would have probably gotten more had he not had injury issues. Braden Huff, again, he's a high usage big down on the block. That's not super valuable, but he's also shown the ability to space the floor. And I think that he looks like he's a true 7-footer. He's close to it as well too. So I think that might help him as well. Are there guys, either ones we've mentioned, maybe ones I didn't mention, that you're kind of intrigued by what their potential future NBA draft stock might look like?
Yeah, I think with a lot of the guys you brought up, unless there might be an injury or they simply have a massive developmental spike, they're more for that 2026 for a later draft class. I think with Stromer, as you mentioned, the length, the size, if he's able to become like a really quality shooter at the college level, the appeal immediately is clear. You have a guy who does something that every NBA team would want. You want to see it in like a consistent role. As we brought up a little bit with Watson, volume and consistency is really crucial for teams to see. And so it's all about putting more of evidence into his file and out into the world for teams to see. For Greg, I think when looking at his advanced stat profile, it's one that has come up a few times in other queries that I look at, and I always am like, that's a bit interesting. I'm going to file that later. I think that teams, as they watch him, will start to really hone in on the fact that he is making like big defensive impacts. You can see in his block and steal percentages, being able to spread the floor. If you're a player with size who can hold your own somewhat on defense and stroke it from deep in that way, you're going to get some looks maybe in a similar range to Watson, unless Greg is showing growth in that way. But those are two guys that I definitely have as maybe later flyers, but really will be interested to see what they start to do next year, as it will be a slightly different like team for Gonzaga, but it's something that I'm looking forward to seeing.
Yeah, Greg interests me because defensively, I've seen him struggle when he's defending on the block. It seems like he kind of gets into issues there, but he's pretty good at hedging the screens. He's pretty good at moving laterally. He's improved dramatically from where he was as a freshman, and that's still the big question mark to me. I think offensively, you can see the role. He's good pick and roll. He'd be a good pick and pop big in the NBA. I think he could do that role right now, quite frankly. He's a hustle guy, an energy guy. I love all of those parts of his profile, but I just worry about what he would look like defensively in ball screen actions. Is he going to get put on skates in space? Is he going to have to play drop coverage because no NBA team's taking a stretch four who has to be used in drop coverage? Like, that's not going to work. So that's what intrigues me about Greg. I love the profile a lot. And like I said, I compared him to Killian Tilly. Eye test for me said Killian Tilly was a better defender, but you're right. The advanced metrics like a lot of what Greg has done. So I'm intrigued by this year is a big year for him in terms of showcasing some of those defensive improvements, because to me, that's the key for him. Certainly you got to keep knocking down, 38 to 40% of your threes. I think he's going to do that, but you also got, I think I want to see, and I think scouts are going to want to see that you feel confident that he's somebody you can put on the floor in the NBA and he's not going to get exposed defensively.
Yeah. And that eye test versus statistics, you can't really have one without the other, especially when scouting. You have to marry the two. And I think next year will be what tips like which one has more of an impact on his eventual stock. Because as you brought up, there were good cases for the good or the less good in his draft stock. So we'll get to see.
There's a really good transition because eye test is something that I'm really want to talk about with the next player we're going to talk about, which is Jonathan Mogbo. We're going to move away from talking about Gonzaga players, talk about the WCC players again. Jaylen Wells, Isaac Jones, not really WCC players yet, but with Wazoo moving into the conference, good opportunity to talk about them. I know many of you listening also follow Washington State, but we're going to start with Jonathan Mogbo. I love Jonathan Mogbo. I love the story. It's fantastic. I spoke with Coach Chris Gerlofson last offseason before the year began, and he was like cautiously excited about Mogbo, but I don't even think he expected him to have this level of productivity this last season. An incredible connector, great passing big, really tough physical around the rim, has a huge wingspan, 7'2" for his wingspan. He's long, he's very athletic. He has 0.0 outside shot, which is going to hurt him in terms of where he gets drafted, and it's going to hurt him in the NBA. But why I brought up the eye test was because Mogbo didn't really play all that well against Gonzaga. And I think there are probably people listening to the show who are like, I remember him, but it doesn't seem like he's necessarily an NBA player. And there's also, I can guarantee you, Gonzaga fans who are upset still at Jonathan Mogbo for winning WCC Newcomer of the Year over Graham Ike or Ryan Nembhard. That's legitimate. Those two guys probably had better cases than Mogbo. Regardless, he strikes me as a modern big without the shooting, and I'm really intrigued. I think it's borderline lazy to always compare undersized bigs to Draymond Green, because Draymond Green is an incredibly unique NBA player, and it's hard to just be the next Draymond Green. But I kind of get it with Mogbo in terms of his connecting abilities and the passing and everything that he can do. What is your kind of impression from tape and analytics and everything on Jonathan Mogbo?
Yeah, my impression from someone who I didn't have high on my radar early is quite positive. Yeah, he played his way into the position he's in now. I think he's had multiple workouts with teams that are picking in like the range of the 30s and the 40s. So I think that there are a lot of teams, along with scouts, people who just watch the game, that really were enraptured by the way he defends, the physical profile that you mentioned. He looks like he can physically hold up in the NBA if you're to put him in a game tomorrow. And you can't always say that about guys who are even his height or have his wingspan. He is someone who has a chiseled physical profile. He moves around really well on the defensive end. It's not just athleticism for show. He's a pretty tough finisher who can like get to dunks. He can get to his finishes there. His connective passing, even if he isn't as much of a hub as he was for San Francisco, will be something that teams like as well. If you're not going to be a shooter at the NBA level, you have to find other ways to affect that geometry on the court. And what they can count on with Mogbo is his passing if you're to dump it down to him, or if on an action where somebody's created an advantage already and he gets the ball on a 4-on-3 in a situation where the court's already bent, you can trust him to make the pass to get the best possible shot. And for a guy who wouldn't be spacing out for that shot, it's really valuable. I think that with the stats, like, it's how he first popped up on my radar. You start to notice like the really big spikes in those advanced numbers. And then in watching him, he backed it up. He was a really talented player. I think he is closer to a second round lock in a lot of ways than Watson. I think that they have similarities as play types with some unique sort of differences and changes, but that athletic profile, the maybe more showy, impactful defense than the passing in that more public way has really helped with his stock.
One of the things that interests me about Mogbo too is just not only the role that he filled at San Francisco, but USF didn't really have a point guard. Like that was kind of an issue for them last year. Like Mike Sheriff-John's a talented player, but he never really filled the role that I think they kind of wanted for him. He didn't become a big time distributor. He was pretty tentative with the basketball, and they had other great guards. Marcus Williams is a fantastic guard. Ryan Beasley's really good, but they didn't really have like a true facilitating point guard. And I don't know, it's kind of a chicken egg situation. I don't know whether Coach Gerlofson was like, we don't have a point guard, so we're going to try to funnel things through Mogbo, which worked really well, or if they funneled things through him kind of first, and then that's why they didn't really have a point guard. But what interests me is, what does he look like on a team with more talent, obviously, as an NBA team, but also just more facilitators around him? I think that in the right situation, and that's true of all, especially second round draft prospects, I could really see him thrive, because he is going to be a much smaller usage player, obviously, than he was at San Francisco. But it strikes me as somebody who, in the right role, with the right usage, with shooters around him, he could be somebody who's very valuable. He's never going to put up huge point totals, but he's a decent enough rebounder. And if he's rebounding well, getting out in transition, making the right reads, making the right passes, I feel like he's a guy who it wouldn't surprise me if he has a longer NBA career than well over half the guys picked in the second round.
And in the second round, that's what you're looking for. It would be great if every pick could be a Nikola Jokic, where you get drafted during a commercial and you then have commercials where you're starring.
Yeah.
More likely, teams are looking for people who can play the role that they need. They're looking for the last thing that ties their team together. And that's what he can do. He can give you that energy, that defense, and that secondary or tertiary playmaking that will keep your team's ethos running and will keep everything going smoothly.
I want to talk about the two Washington State players. There's not often that Wazoo guys are on the draft radar. It's pretty rare for that program. Kyle Smith, obviously departed, now the head coach at Stanford, but a fantastic coach and had some really serious talent on that Wazoo team this past year. Unfortunately, every single player who was a scholarship player at Wazoo is now gone after the coaching change and the move to the WCC. But two of them are hoping to hear their name called likely on Thursday for both of these guys, Jaylen Wells and Isaac Jones. Wells is kind of the name that has popped up a little bit more. Jones is kind of undersized 5. I like some of what he has in his profile, but Wells, the way he shot the ball last year, the size, the outside shooting, I could really see a pretty clear path to an NBA career for both these guys, but especially for Wells.
Yeah, Wells is someone who has, as we've talked about, the skill that sometimes teams can ignore a lot of the other flaws in a prospect's game. He's such an impactful shooter. He does so at 6'8". Having a guy who shoots it so well at that size allows him to fit into more lineups than maybe some 6'5" or 6'6" snipers of that size. He can do it off the catch, off the move. The way that he's able to get into his shot, that's such an appealing attribute to his game. I think what teams who want to draft him in that second round will want to ask themselves is, what else can he contribute when he's on the floor? His metrics of getting to or finishing at the rim left a bit to be desired. His defense, in a similar way, rebounding. If he can start to really show that he has one or two more skills that are like able to keep him on an NBA floor, it makes his shooting that much more valuable. You have players like Sam Hauser for the Boston Celtics, who's a knockdown shooter who's also improved as a team defender to the point where he isn't giving up as much as he's putting up for the Celtics. And that's what Wells, if and when he hears his name either in the second round or as a priority free agent, that's what teams will want to see. How can he get this last little bit or bits to his game added so that he can not only help them score boatloads of points, but patch up holes in the boat so it's not leaking water when he's on the defensive end.
Rowan Kent, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. We mentioned No Ceilings. That's where you can find his work. Is there anywhere else or how people can find you on social media, find the work that you're doing? Let the people know before we get you out of here.
Yeah, well, you can find mine at Rowan Kent, working through No Ceilings. We have a lot of content coming out not only tonight, tomorrow, throughout the rest of the time heading into that 2025 cycle. And yeah, it's been a really great ride, and it's time for the last big thrill with the draft tonight.
Thank you so much again. Folks, thank you so much for listening. We appreciate all of you. We're going to be back on Thursday talking about the first round of the NBA draft, talking about Anton Watson, where he ends up. We'll talk about that on Friday as well. Getting into next week, continuing to talk about recruiting, all that good stuff here as we get into the summer months and further away from last season, but of course, always closer to next season. Thanks again for listening, folks. And until next time, as always, go Zags.